Hi, my name is Crispy. I'm an addict.
Hi, Crispy.
So I've never done anything like this, but then I've shared in front of weirder audiences. I don't know where to begin. So let's begin with how I got into Narcotics Anonymous. I got into Narcotics Anonymous in spite of my best intentions. I used for 32 years. I came into my first Narcotics Anonymous meeting at the age of 45. I was at the end of the road. I'll spare you the details. In my mind, I wasn't an addict. I was just a garden variety drunk with a little bit of a crack problem. My exact thoughts at my first meeting, I got into my meeting a few minutes early. It was about 10 to 8 for an 8 o'clock meeting. And I looked around the room, and it was a big meeting, and people were, doing what they do before meetings, anything but sitting down. And my exact thoughts were, it's come to this, I'm in a room full of people that don't know how to use drugs. And I was disgusted with myself because using was the only thing that I knew how to do. It was my life. Everything was about using. I worked regularly because using was important to me. I stayed out of jail as best I could because using was important to me. So here I was at the age of 45 in a room full of people that didn't know how to use, and I was disgusted. It turns out that I was in a room full of people that were learning how to live, which is something that I, at that time, had no concept of. As I say, it was a big meeting, and there are probably 20 or 30 people that I know today, 18 years later, that are still clean. So I sit in front of you to tell you that Narcotics Anonymous can work for you in ways that you probably can't even imagine. It's important to give yourself a chance, and one of the best ways to give yourself a chance is to not pick up between meetings. When I picked up my 8-year chip and I was standing looking at the room at that time, I realized that I spent the first 5 years in Narcotics Anonymous just letting the snot drain out of my brain. If you've been using for a long time, welcome to Narcotics Anonymous. We got rooms full of people just like you, and it takes a little bit of time to get adjusted. When I walked out of that meeting, I can't remember anything that was said at that meeting, but I do remember thinking, I could do this once a week. It doesn't hurt. It wasn't too painful. And somebody grabbed me by the elbow and said, "What are you doing tomorrow night?" And there's a good meeting over here. And the next night I went to that meeting because really I had nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. And somebody grabbed me at that meeting. And so pretty quickly I was doing 5-6 meetings a week. The other thing that happened is I grabbed onto a guy who had about 6 months clean at the time. I was brand new. Interestingly enough, he had 14 years sober and 6 months clean. He had been going to AA meetings, shooting heroin the whole time. And he had finally decided, that maybe heroin was part of the problem. And that was probably the first time that I got hope. We were sitting, at that time they had breaks during the meeting so that you could, aside from smoking inside the meeting, you could smoke outside the meeting. And, we were having a cigarette, and I said, "Well, do you think this is going to work?" And he looked at me, he says, "Yeah, I think it's going to work." And he started dragging me off to he would say, "Be over here at 8 o'clock tomorrow." And it would be a committee meeting, it would be a service meeting. And I rapidly became what we refer to as a service junkie. I'm constantly reprimanded. It's not a service junkie, it's a service enthusiast. Here's what happened to me. I spent 32 years using. I spent 32 years associating only with people that used. I did not know how to function in society. And by getting into service, I got to meet people who were learning how to function in society. And some of them had been doing it for a while and were actually pretty competent. I started doing service like in activities, and I met people who could actually call a church up and talk to a representative from the church about having a Narcotics Anonymous event at their church. Stunned me. I couldn't conceive of calling somebody who was not a drug addict and asking them for permission to be on their property. So I participated in events. I'd get up early on Saturdays and go to the storage area and help somebody load up a truck. And that was weird. I had friends that had trucks. I'd never had that before. I spent 20 years driving a tow truck. I always had a yard full of cars. They were all up blocks and the hoods were all up and the tires were all missing. But I never actually knew somebody that had a functional vehicle that could be used to help somebody. So lots of new experiences in Narcotics Anonymous. So I went to committee meetings on a regular basis. One time I was on a host committee at a regional convention, and because I had a lot of experience driving a tow truck, I was selected to be the busing coordinator. Our event was at one hotel and the main speaker was at another center 15 minutes away. And so I was a transportation expert. And I was asked to coordinate the effort of getting bus shuttle service between the hotel and the event center, something I was totally unprepared for. They asked me, the first task I was supposed to do was to contact 5 charter bus companies and ask them for an RFP. I didn't know what an RFP was, and they told me it's a request for a proposal, and that cleared up nothing for me. What it was is we told the bus company what we wanted, and we asked the bus company to bid on it. And so that's very simple. I just had to make 5 phone calls between now and a month from now. And so the day before the committee meeting, I'm tearing through this was back in the day where they had phone books. I'm going through the phone book looking for busing companies. And then I had, after studiously reading all of the ads and looking at the pictures of the buses, I picked 5 numbers that I wanted to call. And it literally took 2 hours for me to call somebody that was not a drug addict and say, I'm with Narcotics Anonymous and this is what we want to do. And so I brought that list back to the committee, and they asked me to do a lot of weird stuff. One of the things they wanted to know was how long does it take to make a round trip between the hotel and the convention center where the main speaker meeting was going to be. And this sounds like it would be a pretty easy task. I mean, you would go to the hotel and you would drive to the event center and you would drive back to the hotel. And then the next time you did it, you would see what time it was, and then see what time it was when you got back. So, pretty easy. And so, the night before the committee meeting a month later, I ran up to the town where the hotel was and I drove from there and back. And I wasn't sure if it was the right time during the rush hour. So I made 5 round trips and I averaged them out. And then I made my report the next night. And the vice chair of the host committee, he said, "Who did you go with?" And I was taken aback. I mean, do you think that I'm not competent enough to make a round trip between a hotel and a convention center? The fact of the matter was that, it was only the second time that I remembered to clock it. And didn't trust what I got, and it was a very traumatic experience for me, and that was 2 years clean, to give you an idea of how far I had to come down or how far I had to come up from the using, and he gave me one of the most valuable lessons I've ever got from Narcotics Anonymous. He says, "We don't do service alone," and that was. That somebody would care that much about me, it brought me into the fellowship in a way that I'd always been welcomed in the fellowship, but that was something that I will always remember. A number of years later, let me talk about my first H&I experience. This was when I had 6 months clean, and this guy that had 6 months more than me talked me into going into a mental health place and bring a meeting in there. And he brought me in there, and it looked pretty easy. And the people that we brought the meeting into were not interested, but they weren't disruptive, and it looked like it was an easy gig. Then the next time I went there, I ended up going by myself. I hadn't gotten a lesson about never doing service alone, and it was a different clientele. These were people who were they had been drinking a long time, and they had what you call, I guess, wet brain, and they weren't coming back. And it was very difficult for me to have that experience, and so I didn't do H&I for a long time. But I kept doing service, and then a friend of mine who I did a lot of service with became chair of H&I, and she was working on reestablishing a program in the local juvenile hall, and she got herself cleared, and then nobody else could get cleared for some reason, except she got me cleared. And so there were just the two of us for this facility, so we were going in twice a week, every week, to the 2 girls' pods. And here's another one of my great H&I experiences. So I'm 55 years old at the time of this, and I'm in a room full of 14 and 15-year-old girls, and my thoughts are, I didn't know how to talk to 15-year-old girls when I was 14, 15, 16, or 17, and now at 55, not much else has changed. And so, I was just the secretary, but over the course of 2 years, it became apparent to me that I didn't have to be a 14-year-old girl to talk to a room full of girls in juvenile hall. What I had to do was to remember what it was like to be an adolescent that was full of fear, an adolescent that was using because I couldn't handle living in society. And when I brought it to that level, then we were able to bring a rapport together. Now most of my H&I service is done with men in jail, and I can pretty much identify with middle-aged guys in jail, and that's not too hard. I want to talk about doing the steps. Doing the steps was a very difficult choice for me. Coming to Narcotics Anonymous was pretty much the experience of, being a cockroach caught in a corner. There was no place else for me. So, I got it that I had to be in Narcotics Anonymous, or, any of the alternatives, jails, institutions, or death. I didn't feel like spending the rest of my life incarcerated. The idea of being on tranquilizers and having my arms tied around behind my back didn't appeal to me. And in some ways, death had its appealing in that it, would be the end of pain, but there wasn't anything uplifting about being dead. So it was Narcotics Anonymous for me. And I figured if I just keep my nose clean and don't bother anybody, I'll be okay in this fellowship. Those steps were on the wall, and I could read the first step. It actually says that we admitted that we were powerless over our addiction and that our lives had become unmanageable. As somebody who hadn't done that step yet, the way it looks like is, I admitted that I was an addict, fuck you. And then there was the second one, and the second one was, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And, you can take the addict out of the courtroom, but you can't take the courtroom out of the addict. And I looked at that and I did all the legal diagnosis or forensics on that statement. And it was obvious to me that what it said was, if you can't believe in God, you can't hang with us. And so, and that's as far as I ever got with the steps for the longest time. I had a sponsor who had 5 sponsees just like me. We had over 5 years with no step work. And he was disgusted with himself for, that. And he also, he wanted to help us. And so he said, I'm putting together a step working meeting, and we're going to do this. And so we met on a regular basis. I think we met twice a month. And we worked through the steps. There was 5 of us, and we answered every question in that flat book. And it worked out to about a year a step for 5 guys, to work and read and all of that. And my point about this is if you're at a point now where you don't think that you need to do those steps, but you do feel like Narcotics Anonymous is a place that you can hang out in, I'm going to tell you the same thing that they told me: keep coming back. Eventually, just being clean won't be enough. And I also understand that until you get clean, doing the steps won't be enough. I couldn't do the steps until I had 5 years clean because I needed that much clarity, in my head. I couldn't do the steps one-on-one because I needed the support, of my sponsee brothers who were also reluctant to do the steps. We began to understand what powerless over our addiction was. We began to realize how our lifestyle and the way we lived and the way we thought made our lives unmanageable. And we came to understand that without a power greater than ourselves, there was no moving forward. Sanity was a term which I did not actually understand until I had 12 years clean. For me, coming out of where I came out of, sanity was the absence of insanity. To live in a house where there are not constant battles, where, there are not constant trauma, there's not constant police showing up at the door, there's not constant screaming. To me, that's what sanity was for the longest time. And I appreciated living in a place where there wasn't all the drama of active addiction. When somebody pointed out to me that sanity was living in harmony with reality, I was finally at a point where I understood what that meant. To live in harmony with reality is actually a concept that I would not have been able to understand any time much before that. And that's what working the steps does, is it brought me from a place of being relieved and not being incarcerated, at a place of being relieved of not being in the presence of screaming drug addicts, in the time of, from a time of not being able to drive on the highway without seeing squad cars around every corner, to a place where I could look at the world and I could accept the world and I could accept what reality was, not necessarily like it, not be happy with reality, but by being in harmony with reality, I could move my reality to a place that I was more comfortable with, it to a place that I was happier about. We cannot manufacture our future, but we learn from working the steps that much of what we've done in the past has brought us to where we are today. In bringing that forward, my actions today are going to be of great influence on where I am tomorrow. By not using, by being of service to others, by associating with people who are constantly making their lives better, I'm going to be in a much better place tomorrow than I will be if my associations are all using, and I'm using, and I'm living in despair and in fear. So there are so many levels that participation in Narcotics Anonymous happen, and whatever level that you are participating at now, think of that as just, the door to all the other levels. And whatever level you come in, that's the perfect level. We have this saying, you're right where you belong. For me to not be working steps in the first 5 years, that's crazy. Except for it wasn't crazy, it was the only way I could get to the point where I could work the steps. Some people, they can't get 30 days clean without working the steps right away. If that's where you're at, get a sponsor. Find somebody, that can guide you through this, through the insanity to the sanity, whatever it takes. And I'm running out of steam, so I'm gonna say thanks.